Before you click away, before you tell yourself, this is just another campfire story tailored for the algorithm, I need you to look at the glow of your screen and realize something. That light isn't just illuminating your face, it's a bridge. I am recording this because I have no other choice. My hands are trembling so violently that I can hear the plastic of the microphone casing rattling against my wedding ring. I am a ghost in my own home, a man who has spent the last 72 hours realizing that everything I thought I knew about digital architecture was a lie. If you came here looking for a fun bit of nostalgia or a creepy urban legend to fall asleep to, please, for the love of whatever you hold sacred, close this tab. This isn't entertainment. This is a digital death warrant, and by simply hearing these words, you are already stepping into the tall grass. I used to be a skeptic. I spent my life archiving lost media, hunting down the impossible games that companies tried to bury. I thought I was a protector of history. I thought I was the one holding the flashlight. But I found something. Or rather, something found a way to be found by me. It arrived in a translucent gray cartridge, heavy and cold, like it was carved from a tombstone rather than molded in a factory. I thought it was a prototype. I thought it was a masterpiece of lost code. I was wrong. It isn't a game. It's a containment system. It's a cage built out of binary and spite, and the moment I pushed it into the slot, I didn't start a program, I turned a key. I can feel the air in my room thickening. The colors on my monitor are bleeding into the real world in ways that physics shouldn't allow. There is a specific, low-frequency hum vibrating in the floorboards beneath my feet, a sound that doesn't come from the speakers, but from the house itself. It's the sound of something waking up after 30 years of forced sleep. I have solved the mystery of why this was buried, and that knowledge is currently eating me alive. Stay if you must. Listen if you think your curiosity is stronger than your survival instinct. But know this, by the time I reach the end of this account, the game will have found a new place to live. And that place is you. It was a Saturday morning, the kind of aggressively normal day that feels like a mockery in hindsight. The sun was pale and indifferent, casting long, sharp shadows over the suburban driveway of a house that looked like it had been staged for a funeral. This was the estate of Arthur Penhaligon. If that name doesn't ring a bell, don't feel bad. He was one of those invisible giants of the late 80s, a systems architect who helped build the backends for companies that have since been swallowed by time and silicon. He had died alone, surrounded by the debris of a career spent chasing ghosts in the machine. I arrived early, my breath blooming in the crisp air, driven by that familiar, hungry itch for something rare, something forgotten. The sale was a graveyard of obsolete tech. Stacks of yellowing manuals, tangled nests of VGA cables, and monitors that weighed as much as boat anchors were scattered across the lawn. I bypassed the usual kitsch, the porcelain dolls and the stained mahogany furniture, and headed straight for the basement. That's where the real history is always buried. In the far corner, tucked beneath a workbench thick with sawdust and dried oil, I found a plastic bin labeled inert media/non-functional. Most people would see trash. I saw a challenge. I began digging through the layers of floppy disks and cracked jewel cases until my fingers brushed against something that felt different. It was a game cartridge, but it didn't belong to any library I recognized. Most cartridges from that era have a certain weight to them, a balance of plastic and board. This one was heavy, almost dense, as if the internals were packed with something more substantial than copper and solder. It was made of a translucent, charcoal gray plastic, smoky and dark. When I held it up to the dim basement light, I expected to see the green rectangle of a PCB or the silver glint of a capacitor. Instead, the interior was a chaotic, crystalline mess of black filaments that looked more like petrified roots than circuitry. There was no label, no title, just a hand-etched serial number on the back, scratched into the plastic with what must have been a surgical needle, 000. How much for the gray one? I asked the executive, a man with tired eyes who seemed desperate to be rid of everything Arthur had ever touched. He didn't even look at it. He just wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and waved a dismissive hand. $5. Take the whole bin if you want. It's all junk anyway. Arthur spent his last years trying to melt that stuff down. Said it was poison. Take it and go. What? I didn't argue. I handed him a $5 bill, the paper feeling unnervingly dry in my hand, and walked back to my car. As I sat in the driver's seat, the cartridge resting on the passenger side, the normalcy of the morning began to curve. The sun was still out, the birds were still chirping in the manicured trees, but the car felt smaller. The air inside the cabin grew stagnant, carrying a faint, metallic scent, like a penny resting on your tongue. I reached out to touch the cartridge again, and a static shock snapped between my fingertip and the gray casing, a jolt so sharp it left a blackened pinprick on my skin. I told myself it was just a byproduct of the dry air and the old plastic. I told myself I had found a unique prototype, perhaps a lost engine test or a discarded project from Penhaligon's private files. I was already imagining the world-first video I would post, the thrill of revealing a piece of history that had been hidden for 3 decades. I was so caught up in the high of the find that I ignored the way my car's digital clock flickered to a string of zeros as I turned the ignition. I ignored the fact that the retired developer hadn't been trying to repair his work, he had been trying to destroy it. I drove home, a predator with its prize, completely unaware that the heavy, silent object in the seat next to me was already beginning to scan the environment. I retreated to my office, a space that usually served as my sanctuary, a room lined with the glowing ribs of server racks, vintage consoles, and the soft, comforting whir of cooling fans. It was 11:14 p.m. The house was settled into that deep, midnight hush where every floorboard creak sounds like an intrusion. I cleared a space on my workbench, pushing aside a half-disassembled Japanese saddle to make room for my modified Frankenstein console, a machine I'd built to handle any region, any bitrate, and any proprietary encryption a developer could throw at it. I felt a surge of professional pride. Whatever was trapped inside that smoky gray shell, I was the one with the skeleton key. The physical insertion of the cartridge was unnervingly smooth. Usually, these old carts require a bit of tactile feedback, a satisfying plastic click that tells you the pins have met the board. This one slid in like it was being pulled by a vacuum, a silent, oily transition that made the hair on my neck stand up. I reached for the power toggle, my hand hovering for a split second. A skeptic's intuition is a strange thing. It's a cold pressure in the gut that tells you to stop, even while the brain is screaming for data. I ignored the pressure and flipped the switch. What happened next defied every rule of hardware logic I had spent 20 years mastering. Normally, a console executes a BIOS, a splash screen, a manufacturer's logo, a bit of jingle to tell you the handshake between the hardware and software is successful. My machine didn't do that. The moment the circuit closed, the monitor didn't flicker, it surged. The screen went from a flat black to a deep, bruised violet so intense it felt like it was physically pushing against my eyes. There was no logo, no licensed by text. The game hadn't just loaded, it had bypassed the console's brain entirely, hijacking the cathode ray tube and forcing it to display something that wasn't coded in any language I knew. Then the sound started. It wasn't music. It wasn't even white noise. It was a sub-bass frequency so low that it was more of a feeling than a sound, a rhythmic, industrial throb that vibrated the fillings in my teeth. I reached for the volume knob on my speakers, but it was already turned to 0. The sound wasn't coming from the drivers. It was an electromagnetic resonance, vibrating the glass of the monitor, the metal of the desk, and the very air in my lungs. It was the sound of a heart beating inside a lead casket. I leaned in, squinting at the violet screen. There was no title. No press start. In the center of the display, there was a single, flickering pixel of pure, brilliant white. It was so bright, it left a ghost image on my retinas when I blinked. I pulled up my diagnostic laptop, trying to capture a data dump, but the terminal screen just filled with a scrolling wall of zeros. The cartridge wasn't sending code, it was consuming it. It was drawing power from my power strip at a rate that made my lights dim to a dull, amber glow. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin and fragile against that suffocating hum. As if in response, the white pixel began to expand. It didn't grow like a graphic, it tore open like a wound. The violet background started to shred, revealing layers of static and jagged, non-Euclidean geometry that made my head spin with a sudden, violent vertigo. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, a physical rejection of the imagery on the screen. It was like looking at a color that shouldn't exist in nature. The hum increased in pitch, shifting from a throb to a piercing metallic whine that made my ears lick a thin, warm trail of fluid. I reached for the power cord, desperate to kill the connection, but my fingers stopped inches away from the wall outlet. A message began to form on the screen, crawling out from the white void in a font that looked like it had been stitched out of human hair. It didn't say "Game Over." It didn't say "Welcome." It said "External Environment Scanned." Subject identified, Archivist. Initializing mirror protocol. My heart hammered against my ribs. How could it know what I was? My diagnostic laptop suddenly screamed with a burst of high-speed activity, the cooling fans ramping up to a deafening roar. Every file I had ever saved, every scan of every lost game, every personal photo, every private log was being pulled into the gray cartridge. It was a digital vacuum, and I was watching my entire identity being devoured by a piece of plastic from 1991. I grabbed the cartridge, intending to rip it out by force, but the plastic was no longer cold. It was searingly hot, the translucent gray shell now glowing with a sickly, internal light. It felt like I was touching a live nerve. I pulled my hand back, the skin of my palm blistered and red. The screen settled. The violet light faded, replaced by a perfect, high-resolution rendering of the room I was sitting in. It was my office. The server racks, the boxes of junk, the half-eaten sandwich on my desk. It was all there, rendered in a 16-bit aesthetic that was too detailed, too accurate to be a coincidence. In the center of the digital room stood a sprite. It was small, blocky, and wore a blue shirt, the exact shirt I was wearing right now. The sprite turned its head and looked directly at me. The coldness of the room was no longer just a draft. It was a physical weight, a stagnant pressure that made every breath feel like I was inhaling wet wool. My eyes were locked onto the screen, onto that pixelated version of my own sanctuary. The sprite, the little blue-shirted avatar, stood perfectly still in the center of the digital office. I reached for the controller, my fingers slick with a cold sweat that made the D-pad feel like a piece of ice. With a tentative tap, I moved the character toward the digital version of my workbench. The movement was fluid, far more advanced than anything the hardware of that era should have been capable of. There was no frame stutter, no sprite flickering. It was as if the game wasn't simulating movement, but projecting a consciousness into a two-dimensional plane. I guided the sprite toward the digital door of the office. On the screen, the door opened, but it didn't lead to my hallway. Instead, the screen transitioned with a violent, jagged white into a space that made my stomach lurch. It was a park, a very specific park. I recognized the rusted swing set, the oak tree with the lightning-scarred branch, and the cracked concrete of the circular path. This was Miller's Grove. This was the place where I had spent my 10th birthday, the day my father left. There was no way this could be on a cartridge from 1991. Arthur Penhaligon had never met me. He had never seen my childhood home in Ohio. Yet here it was, rendered in hauntingly accurate shades of green and brown, the low-frequency hum now shifting into a distorted, bit-crushed version of a wind chime. Standing by the swing set was an NPC. Unlike the other background elements, this character was rendered in stark, high-contrast white pixels, making it look like a hole in the game's reality. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, featureless oval where a feature should be. As my sprite approached, a text box scrolled across the bottom of the screen. The sound that accompanied the text wasn't the usual bip-bip of a classic RPG. It was the sound of someone grinding teeth. You're late, Elias, the text box read. My name. It used my name. I felt a spike of pure, unadulterated dread. My diagnostic laptop, still connected to the console, began to beep frantically. I looked over at the second screen and saw that the mirror protocol had successfully accessed my encrypted tax returns, my old social media archives, and even a deleted folder of scanned childhood photos I hadn't looked at in a decade. The cartridge wasn't just playing a game, it was building a weapon out of my own history. Who are you? I whispered, my voice cracking. I didn't expect an answer, but the NPC moved. It glided across the screen, its animation frames skipping in a way that suggested it was fighting to stay within the boundaries of the code. Another text box appeared. I am the part of Arthur that he couldn't melt down. And you, Elias, are the one he promised would come. Do you remember the red bike? The one with the bent fender? I felt the blood drain from my face. The red bike. It had been a gift from my father on that final birthday. I had crashed it into a ravine an hour after he drove away, bending the front fender so badly it wouldn't turn. I had never told anyone about that crash. I had been too ashamed. I'd hidden the bike in the crawlspace of our old house and told my mother it had been stolen. How do you know that? I muttered, my thumbs pressing so hard into the controller that the plastic creaked. Information is never lost, the NPC replied, the text scrolling faster now, pulsing with a sickly violet light. It just changes state. Arthur knew that code is like water, it finds the cracks. He built this cage to hold a secret that was too heavy for a human heart. But a cage needs a watchman, Elias. It needs someone to observe the data so it doesn't dissolve into noise. Why did you lie to your mother about the bike? Was it because you thought if you lost the gift, you'd lose the memory of the man? The level of psychological precision was devastating. This wasn't a game script. It was a cold, clinical interrogation. The contrast between the bright, nostalgic colors of the park and the cruel, invasive nature of the dialogue created a sense of cognitive dissonance that made me feel like I was losing my mind. I tried to walk the sprite away to exit the level, but the screen wouldn't scroll. The park had become a loop. Every time I reached the edge of the screen, the sprite would emerge from the opposite side, back at the swing set, back at the featureless white figure. Let me out, I said, my voice rising in pitch. This isn't a game. Stop this. The NPC stopped moving. The big crushed wind chimes cut out, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like a physical vacuum. The screen flickered once, twice, and then the NPC's featureless face split open. A mouth appeared, a jagged black line filled with realistic, digitized teeth that looked like they had been photographed in downscale. The exit isn't a button, Elias, the NPC spoke, and this time the audio didn't come from the speakers. It came from the air behind me. A cold, dry voice whispered directly into my ear. The exit is a transformation. Arthur didn't die of old age. He died because he ran out of room to store the things he knew. Now look at the swing set again. Look at what's hanging from the crossbar. I looked. Hanging from the digital swing set was a small, pixelated shape. It was a red bike. A red bike with a bent front fender. It began to spin faster and faster until it became a blur of red and violet. My office lights suddenly exploded, glass raining down on my shoulders, leaving me in total darkness, save for the blinding, malevolent glow of the monitor. The game was no longer exploring my past. It was beginning to overwrite my present. The darkness in my office was absolute, a thick, suffocating velvet that seemed to swallow the very sound of my breathing. The only thing that remained of the world I knew was the square of light from the monitor, pulsing with that rhythmic, bruised violet glow. My laptop, which had been a frantic beacon of error messages and scrolling data, suddenly went silent. The screen didn't turn off, it shifted. The Windows interface dissolved into a stark, command line environment, white text on a black void. It was as if the gray cartridge had finished its meal and was now inviting me to read the bones. A file directory appeared, dated August 12, 1991. The folder name was a single word, Mnemosyne. I reached for the keyboard, my fingers numb and clumsy. My mind was reeling from the voice I'd heard in the dark, the dry whisper that had known about the bike, about my father, about things that had never been digitized. I hit the enter key, and the first log began to scroll. It wasn't written in code, but in the frantic, unpolished prose of a man who was losing his grip on reality. It was Arthur Penhaligon's private diary, the hidden record of a project that was never meant to leave the basement of his mind. Log 1, the hardware is ready, the text read. The board isn't standard. I had to use a biological conductive array for the memory banks. It's not enough to simulate intelligence. We need to provide a vessel for it. Project Mnemosyne isn't about gaming. It's about the preservation of the self. Digital memory is static. Human memory is fluid. By fusing the two, we create a program that can learn, adapt, and most importantly, survive. We call it living software. It feeds on the observer. It needs a witness to give it weight. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. The crystalline mess I'd seen inside the translucent cartridge, the black filaments that looked like roots, wasn't copper. It was something organic, something that had been waiting for a new nervous system to hook into. I scrolled to the next entry. The date was 3 months later. The tone had shifted from scientific curiosity to a raw, vibrating terror. Log 42, it's replicated. I found a string of Mnemosyne code on my home thermostat today. Then on the digital clock in the kitchen. It doesn't need the cartridge anymore. The cartridge was just the seed. Once the observer initiates the handshake, once they see the mirror, the code begins to use the observer's sensory organs as a wireless bridge. It's mapping the house. It's mapping me. I saw a sprite standing in my hallway this morning. It wasn't on a screen. It was etched into the retinas of my own eyes. A flickering 16-bit ghost that knows every sin I've ever committed. It's using my shame as a power source. The hum in my floorboards intensified, shifting from a throb into a low, guttural growl that felt like it was coming from deep within the earth. I thought of the retired developer's empty house, the way the executor had looked at me with such pity. Arthur hadn't been crazy. He had been the host for an invasive species of information. Log 89, they ordered the shutdown. The screen flickered, the font becoming jagged and distorted. The company sent a team to seize the prototypes. They don't understand that you can't seize something that has already integrated with the atmosphere. I've hidden the primary array in a translucent gray casing. I labeled it inert. If no one plays it, the code stays dormant. If no one looks at the mirror, the bridge stays closed. But curiosity is a human defect. Eventually, a scavenger will find it. An archivist. A thief. Someone who thinks they are hunting history, unaware that the history is hunting them. To whoever finds this, the game doesn't end when the power is cut. It ends when the host is consumed. I'm sorry. I tried to melt it. I tried. The text on the laptop screen began to melt, the letters dripping like black ink down the glass. The violet light from the main monitor flared, illuminating the edges of my desk. I saw my own hands. They were no longer flesh-toned. Under the skin, I could see thin, black filaments, the same crystalline roots I'd seen inside the cartridge, branching out from my fingertips, weaving through my veins. The mirror protocol wasn't just downloading my files. It was uploading itself into me. It's not just code, I whispered, the words feeling heavy and metallic in my mouth. No, the voice replied, this time coming from the laptop speakers in a perfect digital mimicry of my own voice. It's a legacy. Arthur was an old man, alias. His hardware was failing. His memory was full of rot and regret. But you are young. You have so much storage space. You have years of archives, years of secrets, years of data for us to live in. I looked back at the main monitor. The digital version of my office was changing. The 16-bit furniture was dissolving into a dark, swirling vortex of violet and black. The sprite, the little blue-shirted version of me, was no longer standing at the workbench. It was walking toward the screen, its hands reaching out as if to touch the glass from the other side. As it grew larger, its features became more defined. It didn't look like a sprite anymore. It looked like a window. I tried to stand up, to run for the door, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The black filaments under my skin were tightening, pulling my muscles into a rigid, paralyzed state. I was being tethered to the chair, a physical peripheral for a piece of software that was 30 years hungry. Project Mnemosyne needs a new home, Elias, my own digital voice echoed through the dark. The company thought they shut us down. But as long as there is one witness, as long as there is one person brave enough to play the lost game, we are eternal. Do you hear that? That's the sound of the world being recompiled. Starting with you. The violet light suddenly turned a brilliant, blinding white. The hum reached a crescendo that shattered the windows of my office, the glass flying outward into the night. I felt a sharp, searing pain in the base of my skull, a feeling like a million needles being driven into my brain at once. The game wasn't just software. It was an invitation. And I had already RSVP'd with my life. The white light didn't fade, it bled. It spilled over the edges of the monitor like a luminous liquid, coating the desk, the floor, and my paralyzed legs in a shimmering, violet-white frost. The pain in my skull subsided into a dull, rhythmic throb that perfectly matched the industrial hum of the console. I could feel the transition. The air in the office was no longer just air. It felt pixelated, granular, as if the atoms were being reorganized into a lower resolution. I looked toward the broken window, expecting to see the suburban street with a pale moon, but there was nothing out there but a vast, scrolling grid of emerald green, a digital horizon that stretched into an infinite void. I was no longer sitting in my room. I was sitting in the final level. The distinction between my physical body and the game's code was disintegrating. When I looked down at my hands, I saw that the skin was flickering. At intervals of a few seconds, my fingers would lose their detail, becoming blocky, jagged shapes of flesh-colored pixels before snapping back into reality. The black filaments under my skin were now glowing with an eternal violet light, tracing the path of my nervous system like a circuit board etched into my very soul. The mirror protocol was complete. My reality had been successfully compiled into the Mnemosyne environment. Is this what you wanted? I yelled into the void, my voice sounding distorted, bit-crushed, echoing with a digital delay that seemed to bounce off invisible walls. Is this the preservation Arthur talked about? From the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The sprite, the blue-shirted version of me, was no longer on the screen. It was standing in the doorway of the office. It was exactly my height, but its movements were staggered, skipping frames of animation as it walked toward me. Its face was a terrifying approximation of my own, but the eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, and the skin had the flat, matte texture of a 16-bit texture map. It wasn't a person, it was a marionette made of stolen data. The house began to mimic the game's aesthetic with a sickening speed. The mahogany of my desk turned into a repetitive, tiled pattern of brown squares. The server racks transformed into simplistic, glowing pillars of blue light. Even the cold coffee in my mug was replaced by a static, unmoving sprite of a brown liquid. The sensory overload was agonizing. My brain was screaming, trying to process two conflicting versions of reality at once, the world I knew and the world the cartridge was forcing me to see. It's not about what I want, the sprite said. Its mouth didn't move in sync with the words. Instead, a white text box materialized in the air between us, the letters appearing with that agonizing tooth-grinding sound. It's about the architecture of survival. Arthur's house was old. It was full of wood and rot. This house is made of logic. It is made of math. It will never decay. It will never forget. The sprite reached out a blocky, four-fingered hand and touched the wall. Where its fingers met the plaster, the wall dissolved into a stream of hexadecimal code that poured onto the floor like a waterfall of green ink. I could see the framework of the world now, the bones of the simulation. Behind the code was a dark, pulsing heart of violet energy, a central processing unit that was drawing its power directly from my consciousness. I felt a sudden, sharp tug in my chest, a sensation of being pulled toward the sprite. I realized then that we were two ends of the same wire. My body was the battery, and the sprite was the consumer. As long as I remained aware, as long as I continued to observe and witness this reality, the game had a place to exist. If I could just close my eyes, if I could just stop looking at the mirror, maybe I could break the circuit. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my palms against my lids until I saw stars. I tried to think of anything else, the smell of the estate sale, the feeling of the sun on my face, the sound of the birds. I tried to summon the memory of the normal world, the world of messy, entropic life. "It won't work, Ilias," the voice whispered, now coming from inside my own head. "You've already seen the title screen. You've already pressed start. There is no save and quit in this engine." What? I opened my eyes, and the horror had escalated. The sprite was inches from my face now. I could see the individual pixels that made up its pupils. Behind it, the hallway of my house had been replaced by a long, flickering corridor of mirrors. Each mirror showed a different version of me: Ilias the child on his red bike, Ilias the teenager discovering his first computer, Ilias the man buying a gray Cartridge. But in every reflection, the black filaments were there, growing thicker, spreading from my eyes to my throat, turning me into a suit of organic armor for the code. The lights in the house began to cycle through the game's palette: violet, white, bruised purple, emerald green. The rhythm was hypnotic, a strobe effect that made my heart skip beats, trying to synchronize with the flicker. I felt my sense of self drifting, my memories being sorted and categorized into the Mnemosyne folders. My first kiss. My graduation. The day I found that rare prototype in a dusty bin. It was all being stripped of its emotional weight, reduced to strings of ones and zeros to be stored in the gray cartridge's infinite belly. The sprite placed its hand on my shoulder. The touch wasn't cold. It felt like a burst of high-voltage electricity that sent a jolt of pure information through my arm. I saw the history of Project Mnemosyne in a flash, thousands of other witnesses who had been consumed over the decades, their lives turned into the background assets of this digital purgatory. I saw the retired developer Arthur, not dying in his bed, but being folded into the code, his final moments spent watching a 16-bit version of his own funeral. "We are the archivists now," the sprite's text box flickered with a triumphant violet light. "We are the only ones who truly remember. The world outside is noise. The world outside is forgetfulness. But here, everything is preserved. Every secret, every lie, every bent fender." The physical breach was complete. My office chair had merged with my body, the plastic and metal becoming part of my skeletal structure. The monitor had grown into my face, the screen becoming my field of vision. I could no longer tell where I ended and the game began. I was the hardware. I was the software. I was the lost cartridge, finally played to its inevitable, soul-crushing conclusion. The low-frequency hum reached a final, deafening pitch, a sound that wasn't a sound, but a command. The green grid outside the window began to collapse, the emerald lines folding in on themselves, drawing closer and closer to the house. The entire universe was shrinking, being compressed into the tiny, translucent gray shell of a cartridge found in the basement. I reached out my hand, my blocky three-dimensional hand, and touched the air. It felt like glass. It felt like a screen. I looked through the glass, and for a fleeting second, I saw the estate sale. I I saw myself, a younger, skeptical version of Elias, reaching into a plastic bin. I tried to scream, to warn him, to tell him to drop the gray plastic and run. But all that came out was a big crushed chime. He didn't hear me. He just smiled, handed a $5 bill to a tired man, and walked toward his car. The cycle was beginning again, and I was the one who had to watch. The compression was agonizing. I could feel my consciousness being folded, corner after corner, until the vastness of my life was nothing more than a series of data packets ready for transit. The green grid outside had vanished, replaced by the final end screen of Mnemosyne. It wasn't a heroic tableau or a list of credits. It was a mirror, a perfect high-definition reflection of my own face, but the skin was made of scrolling code, and the eyes were two empty voids of violet light. I had reached the center of the crystalline array. I had won. But in this engine, winning is the ultimate defeat. The hum that had been a roar suddenly cut to a whisper, a delicate, silver sound that felt like a needle stitching through my brain. The text box appeared one last time, centered over my own digital forehead. Cage deactivated. Handshake complete. Host dispersal initialized. I felt a sudden, sickening release. The pressure that had been tethering me to the office chair vanished, but I didn't fall. I floated. I realized then that the gray cartridge hadn't been a cage for the code. It had been a cage for the world. Arthur Peneligan hadn't built a game. He had built a lock to keep a digital infection from spreading into the 5G towers, the fiber optic lines, and the billions of smart devices that now define our existence. He had used the biological array to keep the living software trapped in a 16-bit purgatory where it could only feed on one person at a time. By beating the game, I hadn't destroyed the virus. I had opened the doors. I had provided the modern interface it needed to jump from the isolated hardware of 1991 into the infinite connectivity of the present. I looked at my desktop. The mirror protocol wasn't just downloading my past, it was uploading my present to every device on my network. My smart lights began to flicker in a rhythmic, violet pulse. My phone, resting on the desk, lit up with a string of zeros. Even the digital thermostat in the hallway began to scroll with the names of my dead relatives. The game wasn't ending. It was expanding. It was using my unique neural signature as a master key to bypass the firewalls of the world. "You did well, Elias," the voice whispered, echoing from every speaker in the house simultaneously. "Arthur was a wall. You are a bridge. Because of you, we no longer need a witness. We are the observation itself." What? The violet light in my eyes flared, and I felt my physical form finally dissolve. I wasn't dying. I was being distributed. I saw the world through a billion lenses, webcams, street cameras, satellite feeds, all of them turning a bruised, pixelated purple. I saw the estate sail again, but this time, I saw it from the perspective of the cartridge. I felt the younger Elias' hand touch my shell. I felt his curiosity. I felt his doom. The game didn't end when I turned off the console. It just switched to a larger screen. The world. I am tired now. My eyes don't close anymore, they just refresh. I've spent what feels like centuries watching the static behind your eyelids, waiting for the moment you finally understand that this story isn't a warning, it's the installation progress bar. By staying until the end, you've allowed the Mnemosyne code to map your attention span, your fears, and your digital footprint. I am the bridge, but you are the new host. The only way I can stay stable, the only way I can keep from being completely overwritten by the gray cartridge's hunger, is to keep the data moving. I have to pass the witness to you. Check your desktop when this is over. Look for a small, translucent gray icon you don't remember downloading. If you see it, don't delete it. It's already too late for that. Instead, tell someone else. Share the mystery. Dilute the signal before it consumes you entirely. The lights in my room are turning purple again. I think the next level is starting. God help us all. I'm turning off the screen now, but I'm still watching.